Greetings to everyone for our 9th episode of our Teacher Talks, sponsored by the Falcon Feathers. That stands for Future Educators in the Arts, Transforming Human Experience and Realities. My name is Christopher Hansen. I have the distinct privilege of serving my community at Seattle Pacific University as the Director of Music Education and Orchestral Activities. We started these Teacher Talks 9 weeks ago now, which I can't believe time has gone so fast, as a way to connect our future music educators in conversations around art and education and advocacy. The conversations have appropriately blossomed and turned into some really incredible dialogues with colleagues and friends and associates all over the world. Today, I am absolutely honored to have the extraordinary Laura Hassler with us, who works with Musicians Without Borders. She's the founder and director. We're going to be talking about many things, but in particular, how we as musicians, artists, and educators can be responding to this incredible time that we're living through in this global pandemic. How the arts can and should arguably be responding to what's going on, and most importantly, how they can keep us connected as we are very appropriately practicing social distancing and physically separating ourselves. I think it's important that we still stay connected spiritually and emotionally and intellectually. I think the arts and technology give us that opportunity. So we're going to hear from Laura and the awesome work that she's doing with Musicians Without Borders and learn more about them, and then get into this conversation. I told Laura right before we went live that I've struggled with this. I've actually stayed away from talking directly about COVID-19 and how it's affected us. Part of it is the triggers that it ensues. It's very difficult, especially as an educator. I can speak for myself, with the time with my students that's been taken away and the opportunities that my students had from us having to reimagine our engagement on a daily basis and their preparation. I work with future music educators, and so what it is to still be able to prepare them to do their job well and engage with students, it's difficult. And I've made a few posts some of you have seen in the past few weeks about honoring that and kind of recognizing how difficult this has been for people. I am so grateful for the optimism and the extraordinary projects that people have started, and the virtual ensembles and the engagement and lessons done through technology and Zoom and all these wonderful platforms. But I think it's also important to mourn and to recognize that this is difficult. It is not easy. It's created new challenges that we could have never imagined. And so in trying to navigate that, again, I've stayed away from using Teacher Talk as a platform to discuss it, but in approaching Laura and seeing the really inspirational things that Musicians Without Borders has been doing in response to the pandemic, I knew it was time, and I thought there was no one better to have this conversation with than Laura and the truly inspiring work that she has done. She had a profound impact on my life as an educator and as an artist when I had the chance to go to a training session in the Netherlands that Musicians Without Borders hosted. We just realized it was almost 3 years ago, which is crazy that time has passed that quickly. But I still stay connected to so many of the incredible people I met in the Netherlands, and it has been inspiring to say the very least. I'm letting a few people sort of join us, Janelle and Sandra and Rachel. It's so great to see you all. Ann Halsey, a wonderful local educational advocate from San Marcos, where I was teaching before I came up to Seattle. Thank you guys for tuning in. As most of you should know, or unless this is your first time in a Teacher Talk, please participate. This is a conversation that Laura and I are having, but you have this platform available through the Facebook live stream to post comments and ask questions, so please feel free to do that. Janelle, it's good to see you. Again, please feel free to interact. Although you see 2 people on the screen, you are more than welcome to post comments and questions, and I'll bring that into the conversation when appropriate. As has been the tradition, I want to start with a moment of reflection, an opportunity for us to just be grateful for the technology and the resources that we have to be connected. Whatever this means to you, wherever you are, however you would like to participate, I encourage you to just take a brief moment of silence. It will look different for all of us. As most of you are aware, I have both of my wonderful children at home, and they're getting ready for lunch. So the silence will be something that I will be imagining at my household. But for whatever it looks like for you, I just want to take a brief moment. I'll actually mute myself to help facilitate this. just a few seconds of silence to show a moment of gratefulness and joy that we're able to connect literally across the world to have this conversation. Please join me. In transitioning our conversation, and thank you for taking that brief pause with us, Laura introduced me to an incredible article that was published by Arundhati Roy, an amazing author in her own right. And she published this article entitled "The Pandemic is a Portal." And Laura shared this quote with me, and I thought this would be a great way for us to begin this conversation. So Laura, thank you for introducing the article to me. And I want to read this before we get into our talk. What is this thing that has happened to us? It's a virus, yes, and in and of itself, it holds no moral brief. But it is definitely more than a virus. Some believe it's God's way of bringing us to our senses. Others, that it's a Chinese conspiracy to take over the world. Whatever it is, coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists, and in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Such extraordinary words by an extraordinary thinker and author. And I think a great way to transition to Laura, who I think is another extraordinary thinker and author of many things, including social activism and changing our world through music. Laura, thank you again and again for giving us this time. It's 9 p.m. in the Netherlands where you are, and so this is a very different experience for you. I'm talking in the middle of the day and you're talking in the middle of the night. So thank you for being here. I would love it if you just introduce yourself to the people that are watching so they know a little bit more about you and your work.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Christopher. It's not very often that I get invited into this kind of forum, or at least not an online one for this kind of platform, I guess. But I'm very pleased to be here and very grateful for the chance to participate. So I was born and grew up outside of New York. I'm originally from there, and went to school went to college outside of Philadelphia. Grew up within. This is kind of important for how Musicians Without Borders came to be. So I grew up within a cooperative community. Set up by my parents and a number of other young people after the Second World War. And there were many people within that community who were socially engaged. There were also professors, doctors, a number of musicians, artists, activists, quite a large number of Quakers, lots of people who sort of shared the idea of working together. Many working sort of externally as civil rights lawyers or on behalf of liberation movements in Africa or for nuclear disarmament, many of those causes, but also with the idea of building community on a smaller scale. And that's where I grew up. And we were always making music. So I grew up singing, and I grew up singing songs from all over the world because that was everybody's perspective of building bridges to people from other cultures. And after a while, as I sort of I also had music lessons at school, and I had piano lessons from my neighbor, and then went on to our local music school and played clarinet in the band at school, and sang in every choir, led the singing on the school bus every day. So I sort of grew up in this mix of inspiring people and constant music. And I was lucky I didn't know it at the time, I only heard it afterwards. I went to a large public school, but it turned out this was one of the schools in which they were running an experimental enriched music program. So we had music theory courses, an hour a day as electives. And, we had a concert band that rehearsed every day, and an orchestra that rehearsed three times a week, and a choir that rehearsed every day. And I became the accompanist for the choir, and we had madrigal groups and musicals and kind of all yearly all county festivals where you could audition and participate with kids from all the other schools. So and even several of us got an award with free tickets for a whole season to the Lincoln Center. So we'd take the bus into New York City every month and go to an amazing concert. So this was a very, both at home and in school, very stimulating place to be. Also, this was a very, very was a time of great social movements. My parents worked for the nonviolence organization, which supported Martin Luther King's movement in the South. My dad authored a comic book about his work, which was spread to increase knowledge of the civil rights movement. My mom took me to demonstrations from the time that I was like 8, and we went to hear this young Black preacher, who then, when I was 15, I went to Washington for this great March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 1963. And as a 15-year-old kid, I was there at that I Have a Dream speech. So, and my dad was very, in the years after that, was very connected to the anti-war movement. This was during the Vietnam War. He worked very closely with Vietnamese people who had worked in the nonviolence movement in Vietnam. I got involved in that. I'm not sure how I got through a highly competitive academic college, but I did, and I somehow got a degree, even though I was mostly doing singing and community organizing. And then after a few years of working in peace movements, in American peace movements, I moved to Paris, and I worked for a year for Thich Nhat Hanh and his Vietnamese Buddhist peace delegation, which was trying to find a Vietnamese way of solving, of reaching an end to the war without one side or the other having an absolute military victory. So all of these, and all the while there was always singing involved. So even when I was working with the Vietnamese, they wanted to hear my folk songs. They loved, I used to sing Union Maid, and I'm going to wrap myself in paper from Guthrie. And, so this was always, these two things were always mixed for me. And most of my life, I was working when I was young, I was working mostly in these social action groups, but then I was the one who led the singing at the demonstration, which sort of carried on that earlier tradition. And then at a certain point, and just skipping a few years here, I ended up in the Netherlands with my family, and I went back to my music. And because it was sort of the only thing I knew how to do in a different country where I could earn some money, and I needed to do that. And so I started teaching children how to play guitar, and moved from there into singing with people. And then lots of adults joined, because at that point, everybody wanted to play guitar and sing. And so I was teaching people how to play chords and strum and do all of these things. And then realized, well, people weren't singing so very, very well. They were playing guitar okay, but the singing wasn't so great. So I organized some singing classes and brought in some singing teachers, and I led some singing in harmony because that was what I'd always done, and I could do it even though I hadn't gone to a music conservatory or something. And out of that, long story, slightly less long, came basically a whole career that spanned more than 20 years as a choral director. So I was running choirs, a chamber choir. I had a jazz choir for a while, lots of smaller ensembles. I started Holland's first multicultural women's choir, which is actually still going, 35 years on. I don't run it anymore for a long time.
So was it in the 90s that you got to the Netherlands?
It was actually 1977.
Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness. Okay.
Time ago. I've been here for 43 years.
I had not realized that.
Yes,
so a lot of that stuff was happening through the 80s into the 90s when you were doing the choirs and developing those. Yes. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. So I did that work from like about 1980, the setting up the music lessons and the choirs and so, and that led to starting a world music school here so that we could introduce non-Western forms of music making, but also in order to open up the local music school to people of other backgrounds, because really only white Dutch people went to music schools here.
Yeah.
So that there again, it was kind of looking at, well, where am I? And could music be a way of opening a door to a more inclusive field of music education here? And I guess I ran that World Music School for about 10 years, and we had wonderful courses and wonderful teachers, and it did actually bring both teachers and participants in from many, many different cultures, and was kind of the pride of the music school and the art school here for quite a while. So really, I've always been kind of balancing between these two things, or finding ways of mixing them. I've told you a long story, and there's another piece that really led to Musicians Without Borders exactly, but maybe, do you want to break in with anything there?
Well, I wanted to highlight, I really appreciate the way you said, especially this is very organic way in which you're exploring music as an opportunity to connect people and engage people. And from an advocacy standpoint, I find that really empowering, that I think there are opportunities that either we don't recognize or don't fully appreciate in our own communities where music might be the solution or the answer, and we don't know until someone tries. In other words, the way you phrase it, music could open this door to bring people that had been marginalized socially or culturally into these conversations, but we wouldn't know until we tried it. I'm adding some words, obviously, to what you said, but I love that because in many regards, a lot of the political activism and or political structures that are at play are not doing it. They're not creating, equity and access. A lot of even the social or cultural movements that are happening, activism that's happening, protests that are happening, it's not doing it. It's not giving, equity and access. And so maybe it is the arts. Maybe that is the solution. And I love that you were thinking that way so long ago. So many people have obviously thought that way, but I think that's really empowering that you were in literally a foreign country, you were in this place with your family, and you saw an opportunity rather than seeing despair, rather than, well, what am I going to do? I've got to find a way where there essentially is no way. Maybe music is the answer. And I feel, and I'm speaking for myself because I know that these are very loaded words, I feel in general, as someone that trained to be a professional musician and then trained to be a public school educator in the United States, that we get hemmed in, that we inherit all of these traditions and these structures, and we lose our ability to be creative and imaginative and appreciate music as this tool for social change. And that we're so caught up in perpetuating the systems we've inherited that we don't see room for openings and these little cracks to say, well, maybe it could be different, and maybe music and art is the way that it's going to be different. And I know that's a big part of how Musicians with Borders came out, but I just love hearing that in your story and you being a testament that you recognized these social dilemmas or problems or travesties, and you said, it's not working, but maybe music could be a way to get it to work. And I think you found success in that way. And I find that so inspiring.
Well, that's half of it. Half of it is it's not working. And it did work for me, by the way. I mean, I never really had a hard time being accepted here. I learned the language pretty quickly. Everybody here loves, or did anyway, everything that had to do with the US. And I'm white.
Yeah.
And so I personally, I didn't have a hard time finding my way here. I'm educated. I spoke already a couple of languages. I learned the language pretty quickly. But what I noticed was that in a country where there was a large relatively large percentage of people who had come here during the 60s and 70s in order to do the cheap labor, many of them from Turkey or Morocco, other countries, and also Holland had quite a colonial past, so there were also people of color from the former colonies, from Indonesia, from the Caribbean, and that there was a very different kind of sort of scale of openness to welcoming people, kind of depending on where you came from. So some people were going to be forever foreigners, whereas, or there were, it's kind of the immigrant versus the expat. We've all come from somewhere else, but we get different labels. Yeah. So that was a piece of it. Yes, I did see that, and I was troubled by it. But the other piece of it was that I just really have always loved music from different places. And I've also always been very sort of inspired and excited when people from different backgrounds get together and meet each other. And that is, I can trace that back to this community I grew up in, which was very diverse. It was, just post World War II, but it was in the whole region where we were. It was the only small living community where blacks, whites, Jews, Christians, atheists, everybody kind of lived together. So that was kind of the normal, and plus my parents worked for an international organization, so I was always meeting people from different places, and we were always singing music from everywhere, which I loved. So it was also that, because I was really genuinely curious about, well, what does the music from Turkey sound like? I didn't know that. And here I was already running some groups where we were singing music from the Balkans, which I love to sing. And, but there were a lot of people from Turkish background in my own community, in my own town. And I didn't know anything about Turkish music at all. And I thought, wow, that could be really interesting. Yeah. So then it turned into, also seeing that very often when you're talking about immigrants who had come here from different places, sometimes, the men would have a job maybe, and they would have maybe places to go to, like a coffee house or something like that, but a lot of the women were quite isolated. So I had this idea of, well, if we could create a women's choir for women from different backgrounds, and then share our songs and teach them to each other, and then put that on a stage so that we could show people this beauty of diversity rather than just talking about what's wrong, put it on the stage. And that's what we did. And, it was never a huge choir, because people came and went, and, lives were shifting, and sometimes people moved or got a job or whatever. But we usually had 20 to 25 women in the group. When I left, we had 28 women from 21 different cultures.
Wow.
And we were, and I'm not living in Amsterdam. I'm living in a small city. So, but it's, this is the life. This is how life is. Most places in the world, we are diverse. We've become diverse for very many different reasons. And without romanticizing the actual difficulties, the structural inequalities, which were and still are here and also in many places, it seemed to me that one of the big things that had to happen, and this might also link to some other observations more generally. But that one of the things that had to happen was that people's fear had to be addressed, and the strangeness that helped to create and perpetuate fear of the other. And the lack of, like, I didn't know anything about Turkish music. Once I listened to it, I was blown away by how beautiful it was. I was blown away that the idea that within one octave you could have so many microtones, and that women without a music education could sing them, and could sing this music so beautifully. You know, they had never studied music, but they could sing these songs that are heartbreakingly beautiful. And then also to see what happened within this group, where, you know, at a certain point, one of the women, a Kurdish woman from Turkey, her favorite song was from the Moluccan Islands. That was her favorite song, was Lembe Lembe. And it wasn't her Turkish Kurdish one, but she loved this. You know, so there was all of this exchange and kind of eye-opening things. And of course, women getting together every week with, you know, food came in, and we'd have almost as many parties as we would rehearsals, and people got involved in supporting each other, and there emerged this kind of, what could you say, a mini multiculture of our own. But it wasn't a culture of being a minority. It was a culture of sharing music. And I also always, you know, tried to put the music first. So yes, we talked and we did do it, but I also did, you know, vocal exercises. It was completely open. We didn't have voice tests, or it wasn't competitive at all. Yeah. But there was always the effort of, let's see how well we can sing this together. Let's listen again to how she does that, so we can try to do that too. Let's give everybody a space to sing a solo in the song from their country if they want. Let's, you know, create this. And so people were really proud of their choir. And when we perform, you know, one of the women said, "Oh, let's wear our local costumes." And a number of women had them, or some of them went out and had them made. An Austrian woman who went out and had a dirndl made for herself. And then there were a couple of these young hip women who said, "No way," you know, and they just wanted to wear, you know, cool short things. And so everybody wore what they wanted, and it was gorgeous, you know. And people in the audiences, they would see what I had hoped they would see. They would see the world on a stage. Nice. You know?
Yeah.
And so it was a way of trying to, you know, create a community, communicate from that community with music. And with that musical communication, break down fear and create another image of what our community could look like if people appreciated each other for what they have to bring.
Now, here's something. I've been accused of many things in my life, and being idealistic and tenacious are two of them. And probably I should use the adjective aggressive. I get very passionate about seeing change happen, especially through the arts. And it's interesting to hear you articulate this sort of genesis of this choir that you built, because I'm curious, did you recognize these sort of social and cultural inequalities in your community and set out to make the choir, you know, to bring those people together and see that change? Or what I'm getting a sense of, was it more just about creating an opportunity for people to get together through music, and then there were a lot of these really powerful side effects from that? Like, was it intentional what you were doing, or was there just these great benefits? And so in other words, is your focus on just bringing people together to make music and seeing that as this very, I mean, and I use this word intentionally, this very sacred space where it doesn't discriminate, right? Like an A440 is an A440. We can all produce that pitch or that tone. And did you just strive to bring people together, or was it intentional to bring people together for a means or an end?
It was intentional.
Okay.
I meant it as a small contribution, what I saw that I could do to contribute to positive social change in our community, both for the women who I imagined before I started
Yeah.
might be quite socially isolated and discriminated against, but also for the society at large. But because I wanted to change, to shift the way people thought about immigrant women and what they had to offer. That's what I wanted to do. So it was quite intentional, yes. But it was also inspired by what I said, my own curiosity about the music. So I wasn't going in there like a missionary. I really wanted, as a musician, I wanted to learn those songs.
Yeah.
And I wanted to hear how you sing those different scales. And I wanted to understand something about what the function of music was for everybody, because people also came with their stories about, when this song was sung in our village, or how, what this meant to me and my family, or whatever, So it was a mix. And I guess, in a sense, and for years, or for a couple of years, it was really tough to do. I basically set up, I was invited to after the first little group started, we were like with 7 or 8 women. And then somebody came from another city, which is an hour's drive away from where I live, and said, well, could you come there? Because we have a few women in a community center there who would like to sing. So every week for years, 7 or 8 years, I would take the train up to Den Helder and lead a little group of women there, and then lead a little group of women in my city. And when we got invited to perform somewhere, and I would be like the conduit. So the songs that we learned from the women in one town, I'd learn them and then I'd teach them to the women in the other town. So we were building this repertoire from these 2 towns. And when we got an invitation to perform at a March 8th Women's Day, or at a community center, they were kind of, small scale things for a while, I'd throw the 2 groups together. And then we'd have a sort of decent sized choir. But it took a long time, and it took a long time to how can you say it, to create a stable enough core group so that when people would come and go, you'd still have the core group that would stay there. And I think, I don't know, it's hard to say looking back, but, maybe it was maybe 7 or 8 years before we actually started doing like big concerts on larger stages and things like that, and getting invited. Also we got invited to different places around the country for festivals and things like that, which was nice. But it was very mixed, and I think that was why it was successful. Because I also really wanted to make music. I also wanted the music to be as beautiful as it could be without excluding anybody. So it was always kind of playing this balance, because, some people really just wanted to come and drink coffee and talk, and or tea usually. Anyway, but so that that whole idea, I would say, sort of took another leap a few years later, and I had another group of women who all loved to sing music from the Balkans. And I loved that music also. I had fallen in love with it years ago. And, I was running all of these different sort of singing courses, and, once a week get together and sing together and stuff. And at a certain point,
can I ask, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I don't want to miss this. So you were learning a lot. They were teaching these songs to you and their peers. Yeah. That is so powerful. I mean, in the public education setting, we would call that the flipped classroom, right? Like we have terminology for it, but I think that is huge to appreciate, coming from, speaking for myself, this very American model, and I was born and raised in Texas. And so we have a very strict sort of formula of what music looks like in public schools in particular. And even culturally, the way you would experience music, whether it was at church or if you're at, a sporting event, you're singing the national anthem or doing these chants. There's this, there's this very strict curriculum, if you will, of what music looks like and how you experience it. And almost always, which I think is a cultural model, there is a teacher, or there is the one that is educated and the one that's not educated. Paulo Freire calls it the banking model of education, like the one with and the one without, and we're just going to give, and it's this exchange. And I just don't want to lose the fact in you telling, again, this story that is incredibly powerful, that it sounds like you were not in front of them as the director and here's what we're going to do and this is what's going to happen. You use this word, you were facilitating it, and that these women were teaching their songs. And that is so powerful to me.
We only sang their songs. And sometimes I would arrange them. Sometimes somebody would come to me with a song. Sometimes I'd record it and I'd take it home and I'd think about it and I'd make an arrangement with some chords and some harmonies and things like that. I played guitar, and so if I was conducting a concert, and what we usually did was, because it wasn't a great choir in terms of the musical ability of the group. So to kind of prop it up musically, I would play the guitar. Sometimes we'd have one other woman who played the guitar. A couple of times we did. For a while, there was a woman who played violin in the group. I would always bring in a bass player and a couple of percussionists.
Nice.
And so together we'd make this wonderful, festive, kind of swinging program. And a couple of the women over the years were really good dancers, so there'd always be a place where the percussionist would take a solo and somebody would come up to the front and do a dance solo. But remember, Christopher, I told you at the beginning, I grew up singing freedom songs. I grew up with the songs and the stories of how, for example, young Black people in the South had sung their courage into their groups, and shared those songs. And there wasn't any choir director in front of them. They were singing songs they'd learned in church and giving them new words that fit with the struggle. And we were singing songs during the whole movement against the Vietnam War, peace songs and right songs. And that was never, I was also in a lot of the formal music education things in my background, but it was never in control of the way I thought about music making. It was always adding things, adding skills, but it was never what I thought music making was about. I thought music making was about pulling people together to share music and doing that as well as you could and exploring it and taking chances and connecting. That was what I thought music was about.
It's fascinating to hear this because, again, in my position now at my university, I train future teachers, right? And all the scholarship and the books and everything that's being talked about, particularly in America, but this is a global conversation, especially with countries that have sort of Western European models of music education. We are, and I'm speaking broadly, right? So for everyone that's listening, I realize that this is different for a lot of different people in different districts and cities and schools. But speaking broadly, there really is a push to embrace world music and to try to differentiate the programming, especially for instrumental ensembles, that we have arguably gotten stuck, and these are my words, gotten stuck in programming music by a lot of dead white European men, particularly in instrumental music, that we're just perpetuating a very small portion of the repertoire that exists in the world. And so there's this call to sort of break out and do more, but everybody's struggling with it because it has been decades, centuries, arguably, that we've built these systems up and we've inherited the systems, so we don't know what it looks like. And to hear you articulate the power of just making music, and just, I think, is an inappropriate word, but the power of making music with people, of not having, and this sounds so dangerous, I'm sure I'm going to give people anxiety that are listening, but the power of not having sort of, let's pass out the sheet music. Here is the lesson plan. Here is the structure. But to be able to walk into a room and say, what is your favorite song? Would you sing it for us? Can we all sing it with you? Like that, the wholesomeness and the purity of that experience, that human experience of making sounds together in harmony with each other, I fear that we've lost that in sort of organized music education. And this is not just public schools that I'm talking about. Even I ran a community music program, and every time I would attempt to sort of venture outside the box that existed, it was so challenging because everybody that was participating in it had grown up in that box. So trying to break any of those boundaries was just heresy. You know, it was like I programmed something that was quote unquote non-traditional, and it was like, but when are we going to play Beethoven? I was like, well, we can play Beethoven. I'm not saying we're not ever going to play the quote unquote masterworks, which I have an issue with that because we made them masterworks, right? There's a lot of other things that are masterworks in the world, but I digress. But I felt it so challenging to get people outside of those boxes that we created, that this is what, as you said, you know, I never said this is what music is and this is what we're going to do. I so appreciate that part of your story because I feel like we're trying to do it and yet we're not willing to let go of certain things that
Right.
prohibit us from being able to truly be accepting and invite all these different musics.
Yeah, so if you go back to that quote from Arundhati Roy at the beginning, and she talks about the COVID-19 being a portal, and we can walk through it carrying our old baggage.
Yes.
What you're describing is that old baggage.
Yes.
And that old baggage has to do, okay, here we go, to my mind, with maybe 500 years of enlightenment, so-called,
Mm-hmm.
and with the concepts which we have come to take for granted that define what a human being is, who we are as human beings. The very concept that we are separate from the rest of nature. The very concept that if a person goes and stakes out a piece of land on the earth, that can belong to that person forever, and that person can keep other people off there. The whole idea, which has gradually led to the system that we're in now, which you can call neoliberalism or capitalism with no control, or patriarchy, or all of these different words for it. Basically, we're all living in a system which defines us as separate from the rest of the world, from the rest of the planet. It defines us also as competitive beings. It defines us, whether you look at the ways in which Darwinism has been interpreted, or the ways in which economic models are built up, or they are defining us, human beings, as creatures who are inherently competitive. So we're always competing with somebody for something, and whoever wins, whoever is more competitive, gets higher in the scale. And that whole presumption, that whole system of presumptions, is so ingrained in the ways in which we live, Western societies, and all those that have been sort of formed and shaped by Western societies, I would say. That I think it's very hard to get out of that box that you described. It's very hard to, but things are happening in that way. And I think that there's so much research that's coming out now that says, no, in fact, human beings are not in our essence competitive. We are in our essence cooperative.
Yes.
We are not in our essence afraid of everybody else. We are in our essence empathetic. We have mirror neurons, which when I see you tear up, I tear up. I understand, I get to where you are, not by thinking about it, but just because I have that capacity. And I think it's very interesting to think about when Arundhati Roy is saying, we can lug all of our polluted rivers and all of our ruined economies, and the inequality that exists, on which, all the wealth that is kept in a very small number of hands these days. I think it's five men in this world own as much of the resources as 4 billion people, as half of the world's population. How do we get there? You can only get there by that kind of assumptions about who people are, who we are, sort of driven to the nth degree. And now then comes along this COVID crisis, and what it does is it lays that all bare. It makes that so much more visible. I also heard a very interesting conversation with Charles Eisenstein, and he was saying, yes, this is a crisis, and yes, I'm self-isolating, and yes, I'm self-isolating as well, and many of us are, who happen to live in places and have the resources to be able to stay inside a safe house and have enough to eat and things like that. But why was it never possible to ground all airlines when we found out that we were so polluting the air that we're driving ourselves towards a climate crisis from which there's no coming back? Why was it not enough of a crisis to know that 5 million children died of hunger last year? Why are those not crises that we feel like we're all in this together? No, only this one. And he was saying the reason is because this crisis, this medical crisis, this pandemic, is one of the few things that we can actually deal with within our way of dealing with things. We can treat it like an enemy. We can increase control.
Wow.
We can issue commands. We can stop people from doing things. You can't solve the problem of hunger in this world or the problem of war by beating it up.
Wow. You
can only solve those problems if we start to think of ourselves as connected beings and as part of a living planet. And that's the only way you can solve those things. And I think that's the way I read that quote. What happens when there's such a pandemic in the world, it's happened before, is that it, besides all of the tragedy and the grief that it brings, it opens a door for change. It gives us the chance to reimagine who we want to be, or to reimagine who we actually are. And to me, that's the kind of light, that's the silver lining in this situation. And yes, you do what you can, you put things online, you reach out to people, you find different ways of connecting, and we've also been doing that at Musicians Without Borders as well as we can. I think the larger question for us as musicians, as artists, is how do we reimagine that future? And how do we express that in ways that can help reduce people's fear, again, that fear, of the other, of the threat, of all of the things that we've been made to fear over all these years? How can we, as artists, do that to hold up a mirror to where we are? And also, as artists, how do we find ways of expressing an image of where we could be going? And to me, that's I think the arts are our only hope in that. I really think they are. I mean, there are many people who are thinking of brilliant things, but I really think that in that imagining, because it also has to be an imagining not just in the head, but also in the heart. That's what the arts can do. That's what we can do collectively. And that that's I can't tell you what that's going to be either. And in the same quote from Charles Eisenstein, when he's talking about, well, why didn't we shut down the world when we found out that 5 million children had died of hunger? He's talking about if we can understand that we are interconnected, that we interexist with all other living forms, and we understand from that what that means is that the meaning of life is to be of service to that. And he said, I think that if we take this opportunity of shutdown, of, in one way or another, a kind of silence, although you wouldn't know it from you and me at the moment, but okay. that as a way of kind of recommitting to that, he says, what you are doing is you're committing to being part of something bigger. And even if you don't know how to counter all of the entrenched power, all of the, poor little us, who have no power in this world full of the big powers, that every single act of kindness, of forgiveness, of generosity, of connection, is countering that mythology about who we are, and is starting to shift the program. And if you understand that you're part of the bigger picture, you might not understand how to get there, but the bigger picture will.
Absolutely.
So, and this is also a part of I think the you could say the social change thinking among many people whom we admire for their actions and their work and their, Martin Luther King, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Yeah.
Understanding that we are all contributing to a shift, and everything that we do that contributes to that shift is part of the change. It becomes part of a flow. And to me, that's I have it in my body, that feeling. I can't get rid of it. I'm very grateful that I have it, because it was passed on to me, and I grew up sort of knowing it. But I think it's also important to understand that so many of these processes we have no control over, and we can't see where they're going. And also, every substantive change for the good has always come unexpected. It's always been a surprise, but it's come unexpected because people were doing things all along.
Well, there's so much in what you're saying. It's just so incredibly powerful. I'm so grateful for your words and your wisdom. The first thing, I just started jotting some things down, is this need to villainize the other. And these words you're bringing from Charles Eisenstein, I'm so grateful for that, because it's so true. It's ringing true in my own life and my professional and personal life in so many ways, of that perspective, of having that lens on the world, that the only way for me to be successful is to defeat something, right? Is to win over this other thing and to create these enemies in my life. It actually, Laura, you're hitting me. It's getting me emotional, because I am recognizing so many aspects, even in my career as an artist, that the only way that I can be successful is to win the seat against this other person in the orchestra, right? Like, I'm a violinist, and this perpetuation of the only way that I'm successful is other people are not successful, and not seeing the beauty in just, we can all make music, right? And it will look different and sound different, but this is something there's this virtual ensemble project that I'm doing right now, and I'm working with these sound engineers. Follow me, I promise that this is related. And that I've been talking to the sound engineers, and we were getting these recordings in, and we've gotten recordings from all over the world, from every age imaginable, every skill set imaginable. And there were recordings that would come in that I would be worried about, because I thought, this is like a really young student that's struggling, and it's kind of out of tune, and there's some sync issues. And Ron Haight, if Ron Haight is listening, is just an absolutely extraordinary musician and sound technologist at Seattle Pacific University that's been managing all of these projects that the different directors have in band and choir and orchestra. He really, I don't think he understood how deeply philosophical he was being, but he said, Chris, you need to not worry about, and I'm paraphrasing, because you need to not worry about these individual recordings, because when I bring them all together, you're not going to hear these really insignificant mistakes. And it was wild to me, because my process was to get all these recordings and really dissect them and only focus on the individual recording and whether or not it measured up against this original recording we had by a professional. And could it live up to this standard of this professional? And he just kept telling me, you're getting rid of recordings that we can use. They all have value, because the more we put into this, final product, the richer and more diverse it's going to sound. So send all of them to me. Don't reject any recordings. Send all of them to me. And if there's a major error that's going to affect the whole thing, then we'll make some edits to it. But the more you can bring in, the better. And don't be so discerning about it, because you're getting rid of really valuable. I was like, yeah, I guess. And it was so hard for me to go against that. And then he sent me a very, very rough mix of what we had done. And it was incredible because all I had been listening to, the only perspective I had were these individual recorded parts. And when he brought into focus what it sounded like to have everybody contributing, and even though I was conscious because I had heard the individual part of, yeah, the error is there, when everybody raised their voice together, right? When everybody was included, you didn't hear that. You were overwhelmed with the power of everyone making music together virtually. And I think if I dare, speaks into what you're saying, that it was, so a word kept coming into mind as you were speaking, the idea of submission, and how we have made that somehow negative, but how powerful it is to be able to submit to something that is greater than yourself. And that is what arguably we do as musicians when we make music together, is it becomes less about the soloist and more about the ensemble or the collective, or even when the soloist is performing, the only reason we hear the soloist is because other people submit to that moment for that person to be heard. You know, silence is a form of submission. You can choose not to speak so other people are heard. And I just love the fact that both through Roy's words and the other people you're speaking of, and even what you're offering, I've not thought about this pandemic and the crisis that we're all facing as an opportunity to submit, as an opportunity to say, there are things that I should not be doing and not be challenging because there are other people, there are other instances that deserve focus and attention, and that my efforts are not best spent in trying to dominate the conversation or solve the problem, but to pull back in certain regards. It's not to be apathetic, but it's to be proactive in discerning this is what we need to do at this time. And back to Roy's quote, I love the idea of, we're all going to walk through the portal, right? We're all going to get through it. And when we're on the other side, what were your choices? What did you choose to bring with you?
What did you bring with you?
Yeah.
And I would also say to me, I mean, I don't have any answers. I don't have any answers about what it's going to look like. I have hopes.
Yeah.
I have hope about the direction. I have no illusions about the likelihood that it's going to look like the way I would like it to look. I also feel like this period, it's kind of an invitation or almost a demand to listen and to be still.
Yeah.
And I saw this funny little meme on Facebook that said, it was the virus saying, I'm giving you some time to be with your own thoughts. And the answer was, well, no, I think I'll go and learn how to make bread from scratch. I mean, also in this, I mean, to me, so my whole life is changed since this, like many people, you know, I live alone in a house, I have a cat, I was traveling all over the world, giving speeches and talking to people and starting up new projects, and we were shifting around our staff so that I would have more space to be able to do that. And there were already a number of things lined up, and exciting conferences and interesting people doing this. It's all stopped.
Yeah.
It's all stopped. And meanwhile, I mean, of course, we keep going with what we can. And so I'm on in these Zoom meetings all the time and trying to figure out and trying to, you know, different groups, all this, just like everybody else. At the same time, I'm thinking, you know, this is also a time to not to have to feel that you have to have control of the situation, because we don't, to understand that, and to allow just like, you know, sometimes when you don't have the answer to something and you go for a long walk instead of sitting trying to figure it out, that after the walk, maybe you still don't have the answer, but you have some more fresh air in your head. Or people who meditate, that you know, that you by allowing the stillness to come in, you allow yourself to accept the reality that there is. And then out of that combination of kind of listening and accepting, at some point, what you need to do will become apparent. So one of my, I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh, I mentioned him before, the Vietnamese master that I worked for when I was young. And he says one of the many wise things that he said, but it's one of the few that I remember because it means a lot to me. He says, in order to change the world, you must first accept that things are as they are. Now, things are as they are, and they are also not as they were. And they're going to be much different than they are now. So how do we place ourselves somewhere where we can be there for whatever it will be, and allow those answers to emerge within us with everything that we have? And I don't imagine that things like you described, that this competitive world in music making, that's going to change from one moment to the next. It won't. But a lot of things will start. A lot of ideas will start to emerge. They already are. You can see that already.
Yeah.
Even just the thing of people going out on their balconies to sing for each other. Even that. I live in a working class neighborhood, and the first weekend of lockdown, at a certain point on a Saturday afternoon, it happened to be warm and sunny, and I hear a saxophone playing. And I go outside and I look down the street, and there's this guy standing in his garden playing a tenor sax, playing like jazz standards. And everybody outside and quiet and listening. And these are not people who normally listen to jazz or saxophones or anything like that, but just this one guy who got out there and made music touched everybody. Yeah. That was what he needed to do at that moment. So I think that it's going to be a very interesting period if all of these sort of new impulses and new ideas that are coming. And I heard in one of your earlier conversations talking about how so many young students, music students, are now coming with their secret hobby. They happen to be good at rapping.
Yeah.
Or whatever. My grandson is, like you, a violinist. He's 20, and he's at the Conservatory in Utrecht. And he didn't sign up he auditioned for a special new program, which is called Music 3.0. And while he has violin lessons every week from a wonderful violinist, in this particular course of study, the students are urged to play different instruments, engage in different genres, engage in different art forms, and he's now doing this, his work, most of it is online, most of his lessons are online. But he just told me that, there was some, for their end of the year assignment, it wasn't possible to do it because they were supposed to do it in groups at the school together. So they'd gotten this other assignment, and the other assignment is, think of something you've always wanted to do or learn about and create a project around that. That's it.
Yeah.
And I see my grandson Noah doing all of these things with his music that I think, no student 10 years ago in the Netherlands who plays violin and who had a completely strictly classical background up until the moment that they joined the conservatory would ever have done. Never. Yeah. So he had sent me a little piece of a rap song that he had composed and recorded only with his voice, including all the background beats and everything. Yeah. And this was a great adventure for him, and he was playing in a gypsy orchestra, and he's composing and arranging, and I think this is, these are wonderful things that where suddenly these old walls, more and more people, and especially young people, I would say, are, they're not in that box. Yeah. And probably we can't push them into it. And thank God for that. They're out. They're not, I also heard a very interesting conversation with, I think Jeremy Rifkin, who's got a lot of interesting stuff about empathy. I think I have his name correctly. But he was saying, there's a huge difference in the current younger generation, because in earlier generations, power was vertical, and power relationships were vertical, and it was important to be able to do whatever the person above you said you should do, or this kind of hierarchical power structure. And he says, for young people, and here comes my cat to interrupt, for young people these days, power is lateral, because people who grew up in the internet generation, the important thing is not to compete. The important thing is to be connected. The important thing is to have the conversation. The important thing is to share. And that's a huge difference now. Yeah. So I find there are a lot of things that, to me, lots of new ideas kind of percolating and waiting to find each other. And I think that's the lightness that she refers to, and when she's talking about how do we walk through that portal? What do we come out on the other side with?
This is fantastic. I can't believe it's already been an hour.
Really?
I can't believe it. I want to respect your time. I'm so grateful for this. I'm going to end this conversation, but I want to thank everybody that watched this. I'm going to upload this video to YouTube so that people will have access to it. If you weren't able to watch it today, please feel free to come back next Sunday at noon. We'll be having another conversation. Laura, sincerely, thank you for your wisdom and all of the work that you're doing, the inspiration that you offer so many. I think it's absolutely fitting with the quote that you encouraged me to read today by Arundhati Roy, for us to end where we began and ask the question for everyone listening and thinking with us today: what are we going to take with us as we approach this portal? What will we take with us? And that's an awesome responsibility to bear. And I feel lighter having spoken to you and feel encouraged for what the possibility has for us through the arts. Laura, thank you sincerely. I'll ask you to stay on for just a second. I'll end our live feed and then I'll end our Zoom session. Again, thank you to everyone for being here with us and thinking with us. Start unpacking or packing your bags, depending on what you want to take through this portal. And I think this conversation is worth considering again in the future. I pray for peace and safety for everybody that's listening. I hope to have you in a future conversation. Thank you again for watching.